I suddenly started to wonder what masochistic impulse had led me to choose the theme of theory in the translation classroom. And then I started thinking, well, maybe it was a sadistic impulse that I'm forcing you to confront this question. But I was fascinated, a little dismayed, but not surprised to hear Henry say yesterday that the professional translators he used as consultants for the framework didn't want theory in the framework, and they didn't want research in the framework, right? And then it's also interesting that the creators of the framework decided to put it in anyway, right? So we replay this scenario of academics kind of cramming theory down the throats of practitioners. So is there a better way, and a better way to think about the relationship between theory and practice? So basically what I'll do is we'll talk a little bit about what we might mean by theory, talk about various theories of translation that have appeared outside translation studies proper. This relates to the general theme of the tension between the consolidation of our field and its dispersal across fields, and why we have a vested interest in both. And then finally end by talking about theory for practice that will inform and support students' understanding of translation practice. And finally, I'll end by making a case for what Ngugi calls poor theory. All right, first let's just start by getting this on the table. When we talk about theory versus practice, what do you mean? What do you think about? What is theory? Karl Marx, all right.
I think perhaps we should distinguish between theories for natural sciences and theories for humanities and arts.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, so different kinds of theories. Mm-hmm.
Maybe self-reflection from building from practice.
Ah, right. So some type of reflection built from practice to theorize, yeah. So there are a lot of ways to think about theory, what it is and what it can do for the classroom. In translation studies, we have a very complex relationship to quote-unquote theory. Of course, that first generation of translation studies scholars like Newmark and others basically made theoretical, generalized, abstract pronouncements from their personal experience as translators. It's fascinating when you go back and read Newmark, and he said with utter confidence, oh, when you encounter this problem, you should do this, and etc. But also you see it in Nabokov's commentary on Eugene Onegin, right? It was a very specific project done for a very specific reason. He was teaching Russian literature to college students at Cornell at the time, and yet that became universalized as a theory for how to do translation. More interesting and more problematic still is that he never followed that theory in any other project of his except that one very specific one. So we had that first generation of anecdotal theory, or anecdote as theory. And then we went into a stage in the 80s, 70s, and 80s with Scopus and other types of theories, which were not theories in the natural science sense, but they were model-based theories. So you had, and we all know that traditional model of communication with the two heads and the arrows and stuff. This is not a research-based model. It's an idealized model of communication, right? And in fact, we know that Bell adopted a model that was built basically on Morse code for translation. So these models were very reductive, very problematic, but we went through a stage of model-based pedagogy. And then finally, I'm hoping we're more in a stage where we're doing some research, and how do we build a pedagogy on the basis of that research. I mentioned last time that I ran a teacher training program for teachers of critical languages, and I faced the problem of what to do with many people who had been trained in a different tradition very successfully. And I didn't want to seem like I was imposing some Western theories of pedagogy onto them, and especially in cultures where there might be a big distance between the teacher and the student. Did those pedagogies, would they work, or were they doomed to fail, etc.? And what I found worked in the end was to start with the research on cognition and learning, and then try with them to build a pedagogy off of that. right? So I'm hoping we're in the stage now of translation studies where we have enough research and we're getting more research about how people learn and how they acquire skills, and we can build our pedagogy off of that, our research-based pedagogy. Theory in small t-s translation studies, or what is often referred to as literary theory, is something entirely different. I mean, it's often, I describe it as contemplations of the meditations on language, how language works, philosophy of language, right, Derrida, and even Benjamin. And of course, in both cases, these are opposed to the notion of theory in the hard sciences, where a theory represents an empirically proven hypothesis, right? So what are we talking about when we talk about theory in the classroom? And later in my talk, I'm going to present maybe a compromise by understanding theory in educational psychology as the way people, and in our case, our students, conceptualize the subject area, right? So whatever it is, how they conceptualize it. Behind every practice we know is a theory. So all of those practitioners say, oh, I hate theory. Well, you're probably giving your students your theory of translation through your commentary, through your corrections. It's impossible to do translation in any consistent and professional way without having some idea about how language works, right? So we'll try to find a compromise there in understanding theory as the way people conceptualize the task at hand. And as I mentioned in my first talk, the importance then of aligning theory with your course objectives. We've discussed a number of emerging contexts of translation pedagogy, and I would say not all theory fits all contexts, right? You need to align it with your objectives. Is the course meant to teach students how to do translation theory for proficiency building, or is it to learn about the nature of translation in a general sense? Does it promote translation literacy, or to learn about translation as a linguistic, cultural phenomenon, a translation for research? And running through my talk is this case for what Ngugi wa Thiong'o has called poor theory in his Globalectics, which was the book version of his René Wellick lectures published in 2012. And he says poor, no matter the context of its use, implies the barest. Poor theory and its practice imply maximizing the possibilities inherent in the minimum. And he goes on to say, poor theory may also provide an antidote to the tendency of theory becoming like a kite, that having lost its mooring remains floating in space with no possibility of returning to Earth, or an even more needed critique of the tendency in the writing of theory to substitute density of words for that of thought, a kind of modern scholasticism. And I find that students react to that very negatively to that abstract theory, where they can't make a connection, where it is not moored to what I call the fact of translation. And can we imagine theory tied very closely to the fact of translation? And I think I'll try to give a few examples of that later on. But I would also insist on the distinction that poor theory does not imply impoverished theory. And I'm going to talk about some theoretical models unmoored from the fact of translation, which have the unintended consequence, I think, of impoverishing what translation is, right? All right. Part one, theory outside of capital T-S translation studies. Basically, the most theorizing about translation has come from two fields, comparative literature and increasingly world literature and post-colonial studies. We're probably very familiar with this concept of untranslatability that was presented in Emily Apter's Against World Literature, The Politics of Untranslatability, where Apter essentializes untranslatability by arguing that some words possess what she calls a semantic nub that resists translation. Now, her project of trying to slow the Western Anglophone appropriation of other cultures, I think, is laudable. We see commonalities with Venuti's foreignization, etc. We're in a world where indeed the Anglophone international publishing industry is rapidly appropriating works of other cultures. In fact, the sorry state is, if you've dealt with editors in these major publishing companies, is that they're looking for foreign works that look an awful lot like contemporary Anglophone writing. So you have to ask yourself, where can foreignizing at the level of translation halt a domestication that's happening already at the level of selection? So these are really complicated questions. I salute her attempt to intervene here, but the problem is essentializing untranslatability. Right? So by categorizing certain words as essentially untranslatable, Apter places resistance to cultural hegemony as outside translation. Right? It's a failure of translation. It's either a rejection of translation or a failure. This is one of the examples of what I call impoverishing translation. Right? So at the expense of untranslatability, what we're left of is this very reduced idea of what translation can do. Right? I feel that translations stage the clash of cultures through borrowings and loanwords, etc. So compare her untranslatables to Vinay and Darbelnay's strategies of borrowing and loanwords, which situates this phenomenon within the bounds of translation and the translator's agency. Right? It's strategy number one in Vinay and Darbelnay's 1958 comparative stylistics, right? So that is one of the translator's strategy, to borrow. It is not a representation of failure on the translator's part. We borrow in all different ways for all different purposes. Borrowing looks different in different languages. If I'm borrowing from Chinese, it often is not using Chinese characters, although it could be. It's often pinyin, so that's already a decision I'm making about how to render that foreign word. And the studies I've done on the rendering of foreign words in translations of a single novel, Mikhail Lermontov's 19th century, A Hero of Our Time, showed that there are no norms for borrowings, right? So one translator will keep this word and that word, and the next translator will keep this other word and another word, right? So if indeed these words were essentially untranslatable, every translator would have chosen to borrow the exact same words. They don't, right? So a simple idea, but I think important to say, because many of these theories, as I say, impoverish what we do as translators, and then impoverish translation as a critical methodology. I'm also very leery of this because of my work with Soviet translation theory, which considered untranslatability to be an idealist bourgeois fallacy, revealing, as Andrei Fyodorov put it back in 1941, a lack of faith in the ultimate tasks of translation, a lack of faith in the possibility of knowing an original with the help of a translation, right? And indeed, my sense is this idea of untranslatability and its purchase in comparative literature circles, in fact, represents a larger, broader cultural malaise, at least in the Anglophone world, about the possibilities of cross-cultural communication. Fyodorov goes on to write that this idealist worldview is informed also by a radical understanding of subjectivity, what the Russians call individualism or individualism, according to which, quote, everything outside ourselves cannot be objectively apprehended. The only thing that is real is our subjective perception. He offers a more detailed argument in his 1953 Introduction to Translation Theory. And again, I think it's just important to see this philosophical question, if you will, presented from a completely different political point of view, right? I mean, Apter would consider herself a liberal and intervening in this Anglophone hegemony, and he's coming at it from a very different Marxist point of view. He says, what is important to note here is that this pessimistic view of translation in Western European literature, one that completely rejects or severely limits the possibility of translation, is extremely widespread and actively supported. This can be explained by the legitimate difficulties of translation stemming from the national specificity of the two languages in question, as well as the ease with which one can prove this position through primitive empirical means. And what he means is the simple comparing of discrete units as opposed to taking a holistic view of the translation, as he goes on to explain. In fact, nothing could be simpler than proving the specificity of this or that language by pointing to, for example, the presence of aspectual verb forms in Russian, or the presence of articles and complex forms of the past tense in German, French, and English. One could also prove this by pointing out the absence of formal equivalents in another language and concluding from that the untranslatability of the concept described by that formal element and concluding from that the untranslatability of the concept described by that formal element, although the thought could be transferred by other means, for example, by a collection of words, okay, which Jakobson would famously say in his 1959 essay when he says languages differ in what they must convey, not what they can convey. So you can convey these things just with different means. One should also stress here that the theory of untranslatability is widespread in bourgeois philology as confirmation that the cultural values created in politically dominant cultures cannot become the property of other peoples. Right? So this idea of possession of your property, and we know if you look at early nationalist discourse, this idea of the national genius is supported, is proven by the untranslatability of its core concept, like this Portuguese saudade. And interestingly, though, many other cultures have a very similar concept. In Russian, it's toska, this yearning, this loss, etc., which is only Russians or Slavs can experience. So untranslatability is then an assertion of culture specificity, and as such is tied to a host of politically reactionary phenomena, or in the past it has, such as ethno-nationalism and its commodification in the tourist industry, right? So we're special, that's why you should come and experience our culture, not because our mall is filled with all the same stores you have in your hometown, but right, we have this special untranslatable culture. More interesting, and I would argue more politically engaged, would be to ask not why some words are essentially untranslatable, or if some words are, but why certain cultural actors, people, institutions, nations define something as untranslatable. What is their investment in that? That's the interesting question, right? Why at a certain moment are they defining this as untranslatable? And a beautiful example of this, one of my favorite books in translation studies, is Naomi Seidman's Faithful Renderings, Jewish-Christian Difference and the Politics of Translation, where she says precisely that within the Jewish and Christian traditions there were different approaches to translation. Right, so because the national orientation of the Jewish faith led them to reject translation in many ways, right? They felt that the truth of the Hebrew scripture was so tied even to the words, the characters, etc. Whereas, of course, the Christian faith go forth and preach the good news, right, to all peoples, tongues of flames on all the apostles' heads, and they started speaking in tongues. That's a completely different paradigm. What Steiner would call total translatability versus the Hebrew tradition that fostered monism in Steiner's words. So this is a really interesting project. What cultures, what traditions have invested in either translatability or untranslatability? And so the distinctions, such as the one Apter makes, I think impoverish our understanding of translation proper, is implicitly associating it with some kind of unproblematic transposability. Right? So if these things are beyond translation, then that means translation proper can simply transpose everything. Right? So again, we have to be very cautious about impoverishing our notion of translatability. But we see this even within our own tradition. In Jakobson's 1959 essay, which is so widely anthologized, at the end, he creates this term creative transposition to describe how we might approach poetry and wordplay. But by doing that, creative transposition Does that suggest that the translation proper he described in the first part is not creative, is mechanical? But he went through the whole first part explaining how languages, linguistic categories are asymmetrical. So maybe not hugely creative, but certainly it involves decision making, right? So that addition of adjectives often has the effect of impoverishing the main term here in translation. And even Baba's cultural translation, right? So that suggests that translation proper is somehow not cultural. But of course, we in translation studies understand how inseparable issues of language and culture are. So it's just a tendency, right, to add these adjectives which then imply that the thing itself, translation proper, is this simple act of transposability. And so in the first lecture, I talked about how this is widespread among lay people, but it's actually also widespread in academia as people appropriate translation for their own purposes, and I would say unintentionally impoverish translation proper. And so as a field of capital T, capital S, it's our role, I think, to react against that and to make sure that translation remains rich and available as a method and practice. And I see this, I've started to track this in all different books. So very nice book by Hector Dominguez Rubalcaba, someone who uses translation as a method, as a critical method in this Translating the Queer, Body Politics and Transnational Conversations. But as he says, it's this obsession with failures of translation, right? So the irreconcilability of the mestizo binary gender system and the Zapotec third sex conception hinders the possibility of a full cultural translation, right? But if we understand that languages are asymmetrical, words are polysemous, then this full cultural translation is always a myth, right? Or later, she is always located between meaning systems at the uncomfortable moment of the translation. So somehow the translation is between meaning systems in this kind of difficult to conceptualize place, which of course Maria Tomoshko attacks very convincingly, the idea of the translation as in between as opposed to situated. And in fact, by leaving it in between, she says you rob it of its political engagement because it's neither culture in that case. All right, so I would argue that these things should not be seen as failures of translation, as absences or gaps in the translation, because those are silences within the translation which can be read, right? Read as part of the translation. So, and of course they imply the translation proper then is the production of a full and complete equivalent. Rather, I would argue translation should be seen as staging clashes of worldviews or epistemes. This is precisely what makes translation so interesting and productive as a site of cultural analysis. Right? We know that however much international publishers want their text to be readable, translations will out themselves. We know this from the research being done in translation universals, right? These are translations done by professionals, but still there is this influence of the source text that will out in the translation. Or this idea of translations as hybrid text. And of course, Hermans and Schiavi have noted that translators almost inevitably reveal their discursive presence in a text. And I'm fascinated by moments. This is what makes translations very interesting to study, is because they reveal these clashes, right? And this attempt to somehow bring these two languages and conceptual worlds into conversation. I've been doing work on the translation of the memoir of Charlotte von Mausdorff, who was an East German transvestite. She wrote a memoir that came out in '92, so right in this really charged period in East Germany known as the transition, or at least called by Western observers as a transition, supposedly a transition to Western democratic and capitalist institutions. And it was very quickly translated into a host of European languages. And interestingly, the title, Ich bin meine eigene Frau. Frau is a polysemous word. It can be either woman or wife. The title is I Am My Own Woman, because of course this is a statement of empowerment in English, to be your own person. But the translator is a little disturbed by that, and so includes this footnote right at the beginning. Although the title I Am My Own Woman is a valid translation of the German Ich bin meine eigene Frau, the context in which the phrase appears makes it clear that the author may also mean I am my own wife. No, it clearly shows that she did mean I am my own wife, as she goes on to explain. Near the end of the book, in a conversation with his mother, he quotes her as saying, "As much as I like to have you with me, you are now really at an age to get married." His witty, self-aware answer is, "I am my own wife." An answer that leaves the mother smiling, right? So this hedging, because she knows she's chosen for whatever reasons to give this empowering title, but the context in which it appears clearly reveals wife is the operative term here. So this way, I'm fascinated these ways that translators, again, out themselves and out their positionality there. Or consider this 1998 Russian translation of American psychologist Alexander Lowen's classic text, Love and Orgasm, where he writes, after 70 years of Soviet Puritanism, right, the collocation, seksualna umudryonost, or sexual sophistication, sounded so odd to the translator that he felt obliged to put a footnote and explain and provide the English translation at the bottom, right? He realized this is going to sound weird to Russians because they haven't had public discourse about sexuality and sexual pleasure for 70 years, right? So these ways, these footnotes actually, and Dan and I were talking about how much we love footnotes because they will often be the place where the translator will reveal the gaps and the mismatches, right? So the use, now to turn to post-colonial studies, which has also very productively used translation as a metaphor. And it was, of course, inaugurated in the early 1990s by such influential post-colonial scholars and writers as Homi Bhabha, Stuart Hall, the writer Salman Rushdie, to refer specifically to the immigrant experience or the experience of migrants. It was chapter 11 of Bhabha's The Location of Culture, How Newness Enters the World, Postmodern Space, Post-Colonial Times, and the Trials of Cultural Translation. In Stuart Hall's writing, translation as metaphor is even more abstracted, and it's often used to simply refer to the rendering of reality into representation, right? You are translating this into representation. And of course, in many of Rushdie's fictional works, they're concerned with what he famously called translated men and referred to himself as a translated man. The problem with that metaphor has been raised by people in the field of translation studies, capital T and S, that it elides the fact of translation or translation proper, right? And in fact, that elision is also accomplished on the level of subject matter by the fact that Bhabha in that chapter discusses only migrant writers who write in English. So Joseph Conrad, Salman Rushdie, and Derek Wolcott. That elision is further reinforced on a meta-narrative plane by the fact that Bhabha, Hall, and Rushdie all write in English, right? So, and this is one of the kind of very metaphorical uses of cultural translation in Bhabha, but I want to look at this one in Stuart Hall's, and you see how it's unclear even what he means by metaphorically and literally. If you look at this middle passage, how then to describe this play of difference within identity? The common history, transportation, slavery, colonization has been profoundly formative for all these societies, unifying us across our differences. But it does not constitute a common origin, since it was metaphorically as well as literally a translation. And I read that and I'm not sure what he means by literally, like literally that there was carrying over, right? Transportation, slavery, or somehow interlingual translation. Now, Michaela Wolf has said we should be open to these other appropriations of the concept of translation. She writes, the question arises, who is the owner of the translation term? I argue that banning a metaphorical variant of the translation notion, i.e. what has been called cultural translation, from the field of translation studies would ultimately mean rejecting any sort of interdisciplinary work in this respect. I think we don't have to throw out the term cultural translation, but I do worry that when it is completely untethered, unmoored from the fact of translation, it can mystify not only cultural but political phenomenon. This was pointed out by Peter Ives and Rocco Lacorte in their wonderful volume that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, about a really good way of combining the metaphor with the fact of translation, a volume called Gramsci Language and Translation, where they write, translation has become a key metaphor, often unexamined in such a wide variety of discussions of globalization, in all the different ways the term is used. Advocates of cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, identity politics, and global governance are quick to grasp at translation as a metaphor, but rarely offer much theoretical underpinning for it. All too often, the concept of translation, not unlike language, is stripped of its political content and used to cast a vaguely positive glow of acceptance, accessibility, and interest in things other. And Brian Lennon, a comparative literature person from Pennsylvania State University, in his book In Babel's Shadow, writes that when translation is used as metaphor without being moored to the fact of translation, it is easily conflated with globalization as the play of free or autonomous, non-social or inhuman market forces, right? This results, according to Harish Trivedi, in, quote, a paradoxical eclipse of alterity. Rather than help us encounter and experience other cultures, such translation would have been assimilated in just one monolingual global culture, English, obviously. So specifically, when used only as metaphor, translation may mystify, as Trivedi says, questions of culture themselves, but I would suggest also questions of class. That is, the distinction between the experience of migration for those who know the language of the host country and who come, perhaps, as in the case with some of the writers mentioned, with a higher education, and those who don't, for whom access to translation and interpreting services in legal and healthcare settings are often matters of life and death, right? The experience of translated men such as Baba, Rushdie, and Hall should not lead us to ignore the vast number of non-translated migrants. And this situation has become all the more pressing today as national movements have specifically targeted the provision and access to translation and interpreting services. When I talk about non-translated men and women, I'm thinking of people like Daisy Garcia, a Spanish-speaking New Yorker, who filed a domestic violence complaint in Spanish at the local police department, but Gomez was murdered by her husband before the complaint was ever translated into English. As CNN reported, New York Police Department officials say they can't explain why a fearful woman's domestic abuse report, written in the woman's native language of Spanish, was never translated into English for review and for possible action. Or consider the fact that enrollment in the Affordable Care Act by Spanish speakers in the US was lower than average, due, some have suggested, to the poor quality of the Spanish translation of the website. Right? And so the importance of keeping the fact of translation front and center in discussing the immigrant experience is underscored by the recent politicization of translation and interpreting services. And I mentioned in my last talk, one of the first moves of the Trump administration, and this gives it a symbolic resonance, it was to remove all Spanish language content from the White House website. Right? And I know that in the UK, there's a British Communities and Local Government Secretary, Eric Pickles, who argues that translation and interpreting services are the result of, quote, a misinterpretation of equality or human rights legislation that have the unintended consequences of disincentivizing the study of English. We know there is no research to support that view. And right before I came here, maybe some of you saw there was a video that went viral in the United States of a New York lawyer ranting in a store because a worker and a customer were speaking Spanish, right? You shouldn't be speaking Spanish in our country. He said, I pay for your welfare. I mean, it went on and on. It was really quite disturbing. So I'm not saying that there's no utility in using translation as metaphor. In fact, I think it's not an either or. And there are, in fact, many examples of scholarship that very productively combine the metaphor of translation with the fact of translation, giving a concreteness to the metaphor and a broader reach to the fact of translation. Let me just give a couple examples. Of course, the most wonderful example is Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe, where he looks at the actual translation of Marxist writings, the universalizing theory of the West, to see how it's been localized and critiqued. He advocates paying, quote, critical and unrelenting attention to the very process of translation, to what I'd call the fact of translation, in order to provincialize Western universalist theories and to reveal the cosmopolitan hybridity of subaltern voices. So hugely important work to anyone who wants to incorporate translation as a critical method. And I mentioned this book, Gramsci Language and Translation, which really is a model for how to incorporate translation in all different aspects into the study of a philosopher like Gramsci. Their volume is exemplary, I think, in their refusal to separate the fact of translation from its use as metaphor, examining translation and translatability as conceptualized by Gramsci, alongside studies of Gramsci's own translations, he translated, as well as studies examining the challenges of translating Gramsci's work into other languages. So you see translation being an optic through which to see Gramsci's work in all different ways. And they do this, they claim, in the spirit of Gramsci himself, who is concerned about the actual politics of translation, but also uses the linguistic concept to its full metaphorically analytical power. So it's not an either or here. So by refusing to separate translation as metaphor from translation as process and fact, we resist abstracting works of verbal art from their context of reception and insist on the specific embodiment of ideas and concepts in language. Hence the importance of keeping our theory poor, in this sense, always moored to the fact of translation, but not impoverished. All right, part 2, theory for the translation classroom. Now here I'm diving into long-standing debates over the relevance of theory to practice. As Fraser put it in 1996, current translation theory sometimes seems helpful, even irrelevant. Sometimes seems unhelpful, even irrelevant to trainee and practicing translators, despite a shift in recent years away from a purely theoretical approach towards an integration of practice. And of course, there was the famous debate between Rosemary Araujo and Andrew Chesterman over the relevance of theory, and in particular postmodern theory, to the training of translators. And of course, this prejudice against theory lives on. I think I mentioned this in my talk on Monday. Just recently, there's been published a work by a professional literary translator, Mark Polizzotti, called Sympathy for the Trader, a translation manifesto, reviewed by Emily Wilson, who is a recent retranslator of the Odyssey. And here they really bash translation studies and provide this, I think, perverse image of translation theory. Quote, contemporary translation studies tend to involve increasingly abstract discourse, which is useless for helping people understand what translation is and does nothing to enable the production of better translation. So really absolute in that regard. By the way, New York Review of Books is probably the best periodical in the US to provide discussion of translation, often quite informed and educated. And then later, translation studies is one of the few disciplines in which the study of a subject seems bent on demonstrating that very subject's futility, right? That the purpose of our theory is to say that it's impossible to do this thing. So of course, why would it be useful to a practicing translator? Who does Polizzotti cite? Who is, to use Eco's term, who is his encyclopedia? Venuti, Berman, Derrida, and Benjamin, right? So this is his reductive, distorted view of translation studies, capital T, capital S. By the way, he does capitalize translation studies, and one that aligns more closely with translation studies, I think, small t, small s. So again, this is very fresh. This came out 2 weeks ago in the New York Review of Books. So I want to suggest one way to get over this impasse of theory versus practice is to look at educational psychology. And Lee Schulman, first let me introduce his concept of pedagogical content knowledge. We're fighting a similar fight that we had decades ago where over the question of whether any bilingual could translate, right? And then it was shown that not every bilingual is a good translator and that there is this thing that we now call transfer competence, right? This is the argument why not every bilingual can be dumped into a translation classroom and expected to teach effectively. But there's a second competence that's important there. Not every person with transfer competence can be dumped into the classroom and be expected to teach effectively because there is also something called pedagogical content knowledge. So Schulman defined PCK as a special kind of knowledge possessed by experienced teachers that constitutes a fusion of subject matter knowledge and the pedagogy appropriate for teaching particular topics. It includes knowledge about learners and how to represent subject matter knowledge in forms that make it comprehensible to students. And I think that's the relevant statement for putting theory in your classroom, right? Are you giving them theory that helps them represent the subject matter in forms that make it comprehensible? According to Schulman, this knowledge distinguishes the subject matter pedagogue from the subject matter specialist. The former understands the subject in a different way from the latter. And unfortunately, this doesn't follow a kind of neat developmental climb where we had this debate over bilinguals and now that's gone, and now we're talking about this pedagogical competence because as new contexts for translation and interpreting rise, especially in foreign language departments, we're going back to that old debate where teachers of foreign languages are being asked to teach translation even though they have no experience in it. So in some sense, these arguments have to be raised again and again. Then Schulman proposes several key elements of pedagogical content knowledge. I'm interested in number 2, understanding of students' conceptions of the subject and the learning and teaching implications that were associated with the specific subject matter. So again, that we can maybe find common ground here and that conceptualization of the subject matter is theory, can be informed by theoretical writings, etc. But writings that are geared to the student's level of understanding. Also important in the educational psychology literature is this idea of alternative conceptions or misconceptions or intuitive theories that students might bring with them into the classroom. So student knowledge can be erroneous, illogical, or misinformed. These erroneous understandings are termed alternative conceptions or misconceptions. So I'm taking this discussion from this article, How Do I Get My Students Over Their Alternative Conceptions, Misconceptions for Learning, Removing Barriers to Aid in the Development of the Student. I've often said that my job, I think, would be much easier if the students came into the classroom tabula rasa, without any idea what translation is, and instead they bring with them this really mechanistic view that has to first be deconstructed and removed before you can build something else onto it. So that's our challenge. They go on to say alternative conceptions or misconceptions can really impede learning for several reasons. First, students generally are unaware that the knowledge they have is wrong. Moreover, misconceptions can be very entrenched in student thinking. In addition, students interpret new experiences through these erroneous understanding, thereby interfering with being able to correctly grasp information. So one argument we could make is that introducing a theory at the right level could help both to dismantle this previous conception and begin to build the foundations for a new one. Also, alternative conceptions tend to be very resistant to instruction because learning entails replacing or radically reorganizing student knowledge. Hence, conceptual change has to occur for learning to happen. This puts teachers in the very challenging position of needing to bring about significant conceptual change in student knowledge. Generally, ordinary forms of instruction, such as lectures, labs, discovery learning, or simply reading text, are not very successful at overcoming student misconceptions. I think this is one of the most convincing arguments for theory in the classroom, is that we need to bring about significant conceptual change. And then they argue that new theories and concepts must be plausible, high quality, intelligible, and proven to be generative and fruitful. Again, students do not come into our translation classroom tabula rasa. We know that, anybody who's taught translation, but this has also been shown in the research. This is a recent study by Corbea and De Leon, a study of the implicit theories of translation students, which revealed a mechanistic view of the act of translation as exchange, which did not reflect the complexity of translation phenomena, right? So confirms what I think a lot of us know from our work with novice students. You know, that conceptualization of translation, we have to deduce from that what their assumptions about the nature of languages are. That languages are basically equivalent codes, that languages describe the same reality, and that meaning exists a priori in a text or utterance that is subject to translation. So our job is one of recovery, not of co-creation of meaning. That conceptualization aligns with what we know to be, and the research has shown to be, students' not bottom-up processing, right? The translation of small units, failure to check meaning against the concept, context, inability or reluctance to move away from the source text syntax, and overuse and misuse of bilingual dictionaries to the detriment of other sources. So we don't as yet have any empirical evidence on whether the selection of theoretical readings can change human behaviors. So we have a lot of research that shows, oh, there's some type of alignment with their processing and their conceptualization, but can introducing, we're only assuming now that introducing new conceptualization might help to speed changes in their process. But we do have anecdotal evidence from the reflections of novice translators about what they need from theory, right? Namely, conceptual support or guidance for their decision making, and authorization to move away from the source text syntax or from the available dictionary definitions. This something that I hadn't predicted, but I saw in student logs that they submit with their translations. I didn't think I was allowed to do that or to move away from the syntax. And let me give you a few examples from some of the students. So first, conceptual support for their decision making. Translating Russian grammar into English grammar was very difficult because it was hard to tell when to add words such as articles, and when to clarify whom or what was being talked about, and not just use they or it. Another thing I'm having some trouble with is trying to figure out whether I should divide the extremely long sentences up into 2 or 3 sentences. However, I am not quite sure how exactly to do this. And then in terms of authorizing them to break away from the source text syntax, or what Mona Baker calls the engrossing effect of source text patterning and available dictionary definitions, is I think revealed in the following comments. I felt hesitant to use contractions in a translation, but due to the casual and humorous tone of the source text, I thought it seemed unnatural to continually use terms like do not and there is, rather than substituting with don't and theirs. This was fascinating to me. Why should she be hesitant to use contractions? Because they weren't in the source text. Russian doesn't have contractions, even though in a colloquial register, of course, you would use contractions or you'll sound like a robot in English. Or I felt that the order of sentences needed to be rearranged to be more coherent in English. I was somewhat worried this change might be too divergent, right? So where are these boundaries of what is allowed and what not? But I feel the overall meaning was still conveyed well. So you see them working out these issues. The last sentence was hard to translate because it feels like there needs to be more of an explanation than what is in the source text, but I also wanted to stay as close to the Russian words as possible. I found that there were many words where the closest equivalent in English did not fit as well as synonyms. I found myself conflicted over providing the closest equivalent at the word level versus at the semantic level. And I still feel like the translation lacks naturalness, but I am conflicted over how much I can change the syntax without straying too much from the source text. I think you did a good, oh, that's my note. Sorry, it came out with my note. I think you did a good job recasting the sentence for naturalness. And so even for translation theory in the classroom too, I am advocating for poor theory. That is, readings directed specifically to address what we know to be novice student needs, right? How to support their decision making. Well, first, how to conceptualize translation as decision making, not as simply linguistic matching. Then how to support their decision making and how to authorize them to move away from the source text syntax and from dictionary or bilingual dictionary definitions. The example I gave the other day of the famous quote by Khrushchev, "Мы вас похороним," translated as "we will bury you." Look in any bilingual dictionary next to bury or next to похоронить, you'll find bury. So again, the limitations of dictionaries and bilingual dictionaries especially is something we need to teach explicitly to authorize them to go to other places. This reconceptualizing of translation from a linguistic matching game to a complex decision-making process generates new, I think, or we should make sure in the classroom discussion, it generates new evaluative discourse, new language to talk about translation quality, such as replacing good, bad, right and wrong with responsible decision-making, informed decision-making, consistent decision-making, right? And this aligns with what Dorothy Kelly said the other day, that at the beginning of training, it should be your evaluation should be very process-oriented. And then gradually toward the end, it can become more product-oriented. So decision-making, of course, is the process. Readings I found very helpful. Again, poor theory, I think, but to guide students' decision-making. Of course, Jiří Levy's translation is a decision-making process. Also this idea that the decisions you make up here in terms of terminology will reflect on your decision-making throughout the text. Catford's concept of shifts, that they can be obligatory, right? When, for example, in Russian doesn't have articles, you're going to have to make a choice there. There's no way out. And optional. And of course, Vinay and Darbonnet's translation strategies, especially the indirect ones, those are very important. When Russian is very noun-heavy, like French, and so we verbalize a lot. Again, they don't feel authorized to do that until we give a name to that process. No, it's not violating the original, it's transposition, right, or it's modulation. But I also think it's important that these theoretical writings and concepts, while poor, not be impoverished, right? So they're not simplistic in the end if we understand that we're helping the students create a new conceptualization on which we will then build their notion of professional and ethical translation work. So once we understand translation as decision-making, we can discuss not only how to support our decision-making through conscious strategies, right, domain-specific research, use of parallel text and other resources, but also how to reflect on those unconscious forces that might influence our decision-making, right? Why we might prefer a certain word over another, etc., based on gender, class, regional identity, etc. And relevant here would be Doug Robinson's works on the somatics of translation, right? Why does a certain choice feel right to you, right? To interrogate that and to see what the effects of that would be. And again, I think this requires a great deal of critical reflection. So you can go on from this simple idea of decision-making to talk about what drives our decision-making and those unconscious forces as well. It also involves focusing their attention in order to get them away from this bottom-up processing on the text as a whole as their unit of translation in order to start instilling top-down processing and to expand their decision-making making supports to include parallel text, the SORI background text, etc. And there are several textbooks, very contemporary ones that by Monday and Hatim that are basically text-based, understanding that that is also, at this very novice stage, crucial to their understanding, that the text as a whole is their unit of translation, not words and phrases. In fact, we find it very, very successful in driving this point home to start off with translating a text type they are very familiar with, such as a recipe, and then analyzing it stylistically, doing comparative analysis, etc. The use of parallel text of the same genre or type produced by a target language speaker for a target language audience begin to become especially relevant here, right? In fact, I often ask them to do a draft translation without a dictionary, just using parallel text. Again, get them away from words and phrases as the primary unit of translation. And again, this text-based theory, sometimes we think a lot of these theories are old in the field, but text-based theory is poor, I think, but not impoverished. It's very productive when I introduce Bloom-Kulka's work on implicitation. And then we can talk about what is a text, right? In a sense, a text, capital T, is the written words plus the assumed background knowledge of the readers. So when you take that text and create it in another language, the assumed background knowledge of your readers might be different, right? So they can result in expansion or contraction of the written text. But there are other ways in which this theory can be, you can spiral up to greater complexity. When we talk about text, the textual approach, we're often looking just at the Leipzig school and Scopus and things, and that's fine, but there are also many other thinkers who have come to this idea of the primacy of texts as the unit of from different and very philosophically sophisticated point of view. So I think an underappreciated essay by Michael Bakhtin is his essay on speech genres. And for him, speech genres, which look very much like our text types, are his response to Saussure's separation of language into parole and abstract system. He hated this. He says there's no such thing as an abstract system. No one possesses that in its entirety. So the only thing we can study is the way culture groups, creates these chunks of language. And this is a really nice place because he draws a connection to language pedagogy when he says, when we construct our speech, we are always aware of the whole of our utterance, both in the form of a particular generic plan and in the form of an individual speech plan. We do not string words together smoothly, and we do not proceed from word to word. Rather, it is though we fill in the whole with the necessary words. Words are strung together only in the first stage of the study of a foreign language, and then only when the methodological guidance is poor, right? When the teacher allows that novice student to use a dictionary and just plunk a bunch of words together in a string, right? So this idea of teaching them about this, the way culture shapes language into these chunks that we fill in. And of course, Spivak has a beautiful contemplation on the primacy of text, on text as creating their own, what she says, protocols in this passage, grasping the writer's presuppositions as they inform his or her use of language, as they develop into a kind of singular code, against this rejection of abstract langue, right, as being a myth. I think Bakhtin says at one point, only Adam in the Garden of Eden had access to the langue, right? Is what Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher who has taught me a great deal, calls entering the protocols of a text. Not the general laws of the language, but the laws specific to this text. And this is why it is my sense that translation is the most intimate act of reading. So we get, a lot of people like to quote that most intimate act of reading, but we don't look at what came before. And that's a beautiful argument in favor of a text-based pedagogy. And I love to show students text, and it could be a legal text, in fact, where the author uses especially contrasts, right? The contrast doesn't match up to the dictionary definitions. You have to figure out from the text what would be the relevant contrasting elements. And let me end with another text I find, again, maybe an example of poor theory. And semioticians tend to be very text-focused, very matter-of-fact, not focusing on loss. Similar to Baba saying how newness enters the world, Lotman also felt that translation was the way that the basis of all creative thinking and how new thought enters the world. So I want to turn people on to this very short essay, but I think works very well with novice students, called The Phenomenon of Culture, in which he distinguishes between two types of translation. Translation between equivalent codes and translation between non-equivalent codes. Okay, so now we're removing the concept of equivalence from the words or phrases, and it's the codes themselves. So when, for example, you create Morse code, you can back translate it, and etc. But natural languages are not equivalent codes, right? So you can't back translate the translation and ever get the original utterance. So a translation produced by the first type, when back translated, will always reproduce the original utterance or text. But such translation can only reproduce the initial message. It cannot generate new messages. And any distortion in the message will be the effect of a breakdown in the technology of transmission only. Only artificial codes, however, can be equivalent. All natural languages are non-equivalent or asymmetrical codes, and so translation between them, when back translated, will not predictably reproduce the original utterance. Why, if we all translated a very simple passage, we get a bunch of different versions. But rather than associating such translation with loss and distortion, Lotman notes that only translation between asymmetrical codes can generate new messages, again breaking down the long-standing association of translation with loss. This model of translation between non-equivalent codes, Lotman argues, is at the basis of all creative intelligence, as symbolized, he says, by the two asymmetrical hemispheres of the human brain, right? So then here, translation in that sense is linked to creative intelligence and the generation of the new, right? So in other words, when translating between natural, non-equivalent languages, shift happens. We know that. And so to the extent that shifts are inevitable when translating between natural languages, why should we continue to describe translation as manipulation, subversion, or treason, right? These shifts are inevitable and they must be dealt with. Again, thinking about this in terms of managing asymmetries as opposed to establishing equivalences. In doing so, for the sake of épatage, right, we reinforce a false and I think impoverished conception of what translation is, or that, again, equivalent translation is possible. So which ultimately impoverishes translation, I think, as a concept and a practice, and perhaps ourselves as translators. I think I'll end there.